He didn't raise his voice. He lowered the room around him, and that was far more dangerous. I remember the exact second everything changed, not when he spoke, not when he touched my wrist, but when he looked at me like I was something he had already decided to protect. It was 2:14 in the morning, and I was standing in front of the mirror in the staff bathroom, pressing a damp paper towel gently against my lip, watching the faint red smear fade into something almost invisible under the harsh fluorescent lights. Almost. My hands were steady. They had learned to be. 3 months of this, and you learn which movements don't shake, which breaths don't betray you. I leaned closer to the mirror, tilting my chin, adjusting the collar of my uniform just enough to hide what needed hiding. Long sleeves. Always long sleeves. Even in a house where the temperature was set to a perfect 72 degrees year-round, where marble floors stayed cool under bare feet, and every room smelled faintly of polished wood and expensive silence. I worked in a place where nothing was out of place. Except me. Except the things I carried under fabric and quiet smiles. Emily. Someone called softly from down the hall, and I flinched before I could stop myself. The reaction small but sharp, like a reflex I couldn't unlearn. Mr. Russo is back. He wants coffee. Of course he did. Dominic Russo didn't raise his voice. He didn't repeat himself. The house adjusted to him the moment he stepped inside, like everything understood its role in his presence. I rinsed the paper towel, watched the water swirl pink for a second before it disappeared down the drain. Then I straightened my posture and walked out, each step measured, each breath controlled. The hallway lights were dimmed, casting long shadows across the walls, and I could already feel it, that shift in the air, the quiet tension that followed him like a second heartbeat. He was in the study, exactly where he always went after returning late, jacket draped over the back of a chair, sleeves rolled just enough to reveal his wrists, his watch catching the light in a way that felt deliberate. He didn't look up when I entered. Not at first. I moved toward the espresso machine, fingers moving automatically, grinding, measuring, pressing. Routine was safety. Routine meant I didn't have to think. But thinking wasn't the problem. It was the feeling of being seen that made everything harder. The cup clicked softly against the saucer as I placed it on the desk in front of him. "Your coffee, sir," I said, keeping my voice even, calm, forgettable. That was the goal. Always forgettable. He reached for the cup, paused halfway, and then his eyes lifted. Dark. Steady. Not surprised. Not curious. Just aware. I felt it instantly, like stepping into colder air. His gaze moved, not quickly, not rudely, just enough to notice what most people missed. The way my sleeve sat slightly lower on one arm. The faint stiffness in my posture. The way I kept my hands just out of direct light. I turned slightly, instinctively, but it was too late. "You're working late," he said, his voice low, controlled, the kind that didn't need volume to carry weight. "Yes, sir." One word. Safe. Simple. He nodded once, like he had expected that answer, and for a second I thought that was it. That I could leave. That I had done my job. But then he set the cup down without drinking and leaned back in his chair, his eyes still on me. Not harsh, not soft, just fixed. "Emily," he said, and hearing my name from him felt different, heavier somehow. I stopped walking. I didn't turn around right away. I didn't want to. "Yes, sir." A pause. Just long enough to make my heart beat louder in my ears. "Look at me." And I did. I always did. Because in this house, when Dominic Russo asked for something, the world didn't argue. It complied. I turned slowly, like if I moved too fast something would break. Something invisible but fragile. And when my eyes met his again, I understood what people meant when they said silence could feel loud. Because the room did not change. The lights did not flicker. Nothing moved except the weight in the air pressing down on my chest, making every breath feel deliberate, measured, chosen. And he watched me the way someone watches a detail they are not going to ignore. Not now, not later, not ever. And I realized in that moment that being invisible had never really been an option in this house. Not to him. Never to him. "Come here," he said, not harsh, not gentle, just certain. And I obeyed before I could think about it. 2 steps forward, then one more, until I stood just across the desk from him, close enough to notice the faint scent of espresso, and something darker, something expensive, something that did not belong to my world. My hands stayed at my sides, fingers lightly curled, controlled, always controlled. But he noticed that too. Of course he did. He noticed everything. His gaze dropped briefly. Not to my face, not to my eyes, but to my wrist, the one I had kept turned slightly away from the light, the one I had trained myself to hide without thinking, and my instinct kicked in instantly. I shifted, subtle, practiced, but his voice stopped me before I could complete the movement. "Do not," he said, and it was the first time there was something sharper underneath the calm. Not anger, not yet, but something closer to a line being drawn. I froze, not because I was afraid of him, not exactly, but because I understood that this was not a moment I could control, not anymore. His hand moved then, slow enough that I saw it coming, fast enough that I could not stop it, fingers closing gently around my wrist, not tight, not painful, just firm enough to hold me in place. And for a second I forgot how to breathe, not because of the contact, but because of the way he held me, like I was something fragile, something he was careful not to break. And that confused me more than anything else. His thumb brushed lightly against the fabric of my sleeve, then paused, as if giving me one last chance to pull away. I did not, I could not, and with a small, controlled motion, he pushed the sleeve back just enough for the truth to show. Not all of it, not everything, just enough, just the edge of what I had been hiding, and the room shifted again, not physically, but in a way that felt just as real. His expression did not change, not in any obvious way, but his jaw tightened, just slightly, and his eyes, they did not look shocked, they looked focused, like he had just found the missing piece to something he had already been solving. "Who did this?" he asked, and it was not a question, not really, it was a statement waiting for confirmation, and I did what I had practiced, what I had perfected. I pulled my wrist back gently, not yanking, not panicking, just enough to create space, and I shook my head once, small, dismissive. "It is nothing," I said, my voice steady, calm, almost convincing. "I hit it on a cabinet door earlier." The lie came easily. It always did. It had to. Lies were safer than truth. Lies did not change anything. Truth did. And I could not afford that. Not here, not now. He watched me for a long second, 2 seconds, maybe longer. Time stretched in a way that made it impossible to measure. And then he leaned back slightly, releasing my wrist without resistance. But the absence of his touch did not feel like freedom. It felt like something had just begun instead of ended. "Cabinet doors do not leave patterns like that," he said quietly, not accusing, not mocking, just stating a fact. And my chest tightened because he was right. Because of course he was right. But I kept my expression neutral. I had learned how to do that too. How to make my face a place where nothing stayed long enough to be read. "I should get back to work," I said, shifting my weight slightly, already preparing to leave, to escape, to disappear back into the routine where things made sense. But his voice stopped me again, softer this time, almost thoughtful. "Emily," he said, and I hesitated, just enough for him to know I was still listening. "No one in this house gets hurt without me." Knowing why, the words settled into the space between us, heavy, deliberate, and for the first time since I started working here, I did not feel invisible. I felt seen in a way that was dangerous, not because he might expose me, but because he might decide I was worth protecting, and I did not know what that would cost me. I did not sleep that night. Not really. I lay in my bed staring at the ceiling, counting the faint cracks in the paint like they could anchor me to something normal, something quiet. But all I could hear was his voice repeating in my head, steady and certain. "No one in this house gets hurt without me knowing why." And the words did not feel like a threat. They felt like a promise. And somehow that was worse. Because promises from men like Dominic Russo did not come without consequences. They came with decisions already made, lines already drawn, and I did not know which side of that line I was standing on. The alarm on my phone buzzed at 6 in the morning, sharp and unforgiving, and I turned it off before it could make a second sound. My body, already moving, already slipping back into routine, uniform pressed, hair tied back, sleeves pulled down, carefully over my wrists, everything in place. Everything controlled. The kitchen was quiet when I stepped in, the early light filtering through the tall windows, turning the marble countertops pale gold. And for a moment it almost felt peaceful. Almost. I moved through my tasks automatically, preparing breakfast trays, checking inventory, avoiding mirrors, avoiding thoughts, because thinking led back to him, and I could not afford that. Not while I was still trying to keep everything contained. But the house felt different, subtle, almost imperceptible. like something had shifted just beneath the surface. Staff moved a little more carefully. Voices stayed a little lower, and I caught glances, not obvious, not direct, but enough to make my skin prickle, like I was no longer just another invisible part of the routine, like I had been noticed, cataloged, placed somewhere I did not understand. Around 9:30, I stepped outside briefly to take out a small bag of trash, the cool morning air brushing against my face, grounding, steadying, and for a second I closed my eyes, breathing it in, telling myself everything was fine, everything was the same. But when I opened them, I saw one of the security men standing a few feet away, not close enough to be intrusive, not far enough to be casual, his posture relaxed, his gaze neutral, but he was watching, not me exactly, but the space around me, like he had been assigned to that exact spot for a reason, and my chest tightened just slightly. I had worked here long enough to understand how this place functioned. Nothing was random, nothing was accidental, everything was intentional. I lowered my head and walked back inside without saying a word, but the feeling followed me, that quiet awareness, that invisible thread pulling tighter with every step. By noon, it was impossible to ignore. 2 more security personnel had rotated through the hallway near the staff quarters, their presence subtle but constant, and every time I moved from one room to another, I felt it, the shift of attention, the quiet tracking, not invasive, not aggressive, just there, like a shadow that did not quite belong to me. I kept working, because that was what I knew how to do, what I could control, but my thoughts kept circling back to one thing. He had not asked again. He had not confronted me. He had not pushed, and somehow that silence felt heavier than any question could have. It meant he was not guessing anymore. He was confirming, and that realization settled deep in my stomach, cold and steady. Late in the afternoon, I was in the laundry room, folding clean linens, the repetitive motion calming in a way nothing else had been all day. When my phone buzzed quietly in my pocket, I froze for a second, staring at the screen before I even pulled it out, because I already knew who it was. The name confirmed it, and my pulse shifted, not racing, not panicking, just tightening, like something inside me bracing for impact. I stared at the message without opening it, my thumb hovering, debating, delaying, but that was useless. Delay did not change anything. It never had. So I opened it, just one line, simple, familiar, heavy in all the ways that mattered. Where are you? I swallowed, my throat suddenly dry, and for a moment I considered not answering. Just this once, just to see what would happen, but I knew better. Silence had consequences, ones I could not predict, ones I could not control. So I typed back quickly, keeping it neutral, keeping it safe. At work, a pause. Then another message appeared almost instantly. I am coming by later, my fingers stilled on the screen, the room around me fading slightly at the edges, because that was the one thing I could not manage. Not here, not now, not with everything already shifting, not with him already watching. I locked my phone and slipped it back into my pocket, my hands returning to the linens, even though I could not feel them anymore. Because for the first time since I started working in this house, the two worlds I had kept carefully separate were about to collide, and I had no idea which one would break first. By the time the sun dipped low enough to turn the windows into mirrors, I could feel it in my bones, that quiet pressure building, the kind that does not explode. It settles, it waits, it chooses its moment. And I moved through the evening routine like I always did, setting the dining table, aligning silverware down to the inch, adjusting candles that would probably never be lit. Because perfection in this house was not about use. It was about control, and control was something I was starting to lose. I checked my phone twice, then 3 times. Even though there were no new messages, the last one still sitting there like a countdown, I could not stop. I'm coming by later. Later had no time attached to it. No warning, no boundary, and that made it worse, because it could be any second, any minute, and I would not be ready. I would never be ready. Around 7:30, the front gates opened. I heard it from the kitchen. The faint mechanical hum, followed by the low roll of tires on gravel, and my hands stilled on the countertop, just for a second, just long enough for the weight of that sound to settle into my chest. One of the other staff members glanced at me, quick, subtle, but I caught it. That flicker of awareness, like they knew something I did not, or maybe like they knew something I was trying too hard to hide. I wiped my hands on a towel, forced my shoulders back, and kept moving, because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant panic, and panic was something I could not afford here, not in this house, not under his watch. The door opened. Voices carried faintly through the hallway. Unfamiliar but not unexpected, and I stayed where I was, counting seconds in my head. 5, 10, 15, waiting for footsteps that did not come, waiting for something that did not happen, until finally, the silence stretched too long, and I knew that was worse, because silence in this place was never empty. It was intentional. I stepped out into the hallway slowly. Each step measured, each breath controlled, and that was when I saw him. Not Dominic, not yet, but the man I had been trying not to think about all day, standing just inside the entryway. Like he belonged there, like he had every right to cross that threshold, his posture relaxed, his expression familiar in a way that made my stomach tighten, not because of what he was doing, but because of what he represented, the part of my life I had kept separate, the part that did not belong in this house. His eyes found mine instantly, and there it was, that look, not loud, not aggressive, just expectant, like everything between us was already understood, like there was no need to explain. Emily, he said, my name sounding different in his voice, heavier, closer, and I forced myself to move forward, to close the distance, because standing still would only make it worse. You said you were working late, he added, glancing around the space with quiet curiosity, taking in the polished floors, the high ceilings, the kind of wealth that did not need to announce itself. I nodded once, keeping my voice even. I am, I said, simple, controlled, safe, but I could feel it already, the shift, the way the air had changed, the way this space no longer felt contained. And then, before I could say anything else, before I could guide him out, before I could fix this, another presence filled the room, not loud, not rushed, just there, and I did not have to turn to know who it was. The silence deepened, sharpened, like the entire house had taken a breath and decided not to release it. Dominic Russo stepped into view with the same calm precision he carried into everything, his gaze moving once, quick, deliberate, taking in the scene in a way that missed nothing, and then settling, not on the man, not on the room, but on me. And in that single second, I understood something I had not fully grasped before. This was no longer just about what I was hiding. It was about what he had already decided to see. You have a visitor, he said, his voice even, unreadable. But there was something underneath it now, something quieter, something that felt like a line being drawn in real time, and I stood there between them, caught in the space where two worlds had finally collided, knowing that whatever happened next was not going to be something I could control, and for the first time, that did not feel like the worst part. No one moved at first, not him, not me, not even the air between us, and it felt like time had slowed down just enough to make every detail sharper, every breath louder, every glance heavier than it should have been. I could feel my pulse in my fingertips, steady but insistent, like it was trying to warn me that something had already shifted beyond repair. Dominic did not look surprised, not even slightly. His gaze moved once, taking in the man standing across from me, then returned to me with that same controlled focus, like everything else in the room was secondary, like I was the only variable that mattered. I did not realize you were expecting company, he said, his tone even, polite in a way that did not feel polite at all, and I opened my mouth to respond, but the words caught somewhere between my chest and my throat, because there was no good answer, no safe explanation that would not unravel everything I had been trying to keep separate. I was just stopping by, the man said instead, stepping forward slightly, his voice carrying a casual confidence that did not belong in this house, not under this roof, and I felt it immediately, that imbalance, that difference in gravity, like one of them understood the rules of this world, and the other did not. Dominic's eyes flicked to him briefly, not dismissive, not impressed, just measuring, always measuring. This is a private residence, he replied, still calm, still controlled, but there was a quiet finality in the words that made the space feel smaller, tighter, and I knew this was the moment where everything could tip in one direction or the other. I invited him. I said quickly, the words leaving my mouth before I could stop them, and both of them looked at me then, really looked, and for a second I felt exposed in a way that had nothing to do with bruises or secrets. It was about choice. about claiming something I was not sure I still had control over. Dominic held my gaze a fraction longer than necessary, and then something shifted, subtle, almost invisible, but I felt it, like a decision being made behind those steady eyes. "Of course," he said, and stepped aside slightly, not in surrender, not in retreat, but in something far more deliberate, like he was allowing something to happen because he wanted to see how it unfolded, and that realization settled deep in my chest, cold and steady. The man moved closer to me then, too close for this space, too familiar for this house, his hand brushing lightly against my arm as if the gesture was natural, as if it belonged here, and my body reacted before my mind did, a slight stiffness, a barely noticeable shift away, but not enough to be obvious, not enough to draw attention, except it did, because Dominic noticed everything. His gaze dropped for a fraction of a second to where that contact had happened, then returned to my face. And this time there was something different in his expression, not anger, not yet, but something sharper, something that felt like the beginning of a boundary being enforced. "We will need the kitchen cleared in 10 minutes, he said, his voice directed at me, but his attention still anchored, still focused. "Yes, sir," I replied automatically, the words familiar. Safe, but they sounded different now, like they carried more weight than they had before. The man beside me exhaled softly, almost amused. "You work for him," he said, not asking, just stating, and I nodded once, keeping my eyes forward, because looking at either of them felt like stepping deeper into something I could not navigate. "That explains a lot," he added, his tone light, but there was an edge underneath it that made my stomach tighten. Dominic did not respond immediately, and somehow, that silence was louder than anything he could have said. He simply watched, observed, catalogued, like he was piecing together a puzzle that had already begun to form in his mind long before this moment. "Emily," he said finally, and I felt my name settle differently this time. Heavier, more deliberate. "Finish your tasks." A simple instruction, one I had heard 100 times before, but this time it felt like something else entirely, like permission, like a warning, like a line I was being told not to cross again. I nodded, turned, and walked away without looking back, but I could feel it, that tension stretching behind me, pulling tighter with every step, because I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that whatever Dominic Russo had just seen, whatever he had just decided, it was not something that would be ignored, and for the first time, I was not sure if I wanted it to be. I finished the kitchen exactly 9 minutes later, not because I was rushing, but because I needed something to hold on to, something precise, something measurable, because everything else had started to feel uncertain, like the ground beneath me was shifting in ways I could not predict. I wiped the last surface, aligned the final plate, and stepped back, forcing myself to breathe evenly. But my attention was not on the room. It was on the hallway beyond it, on the silence that had stretched too long, on the absence of voices that should have been there. Because quiet like this did not mean peace. It meant something was happening somewhere else, something I was not meant to see. I told myself to stay where I was, to follow instructions, to keep things simple, but my feet moved anyway, slow, careful steps toward the corridor, drawn by something I could not name. And as I reached the corner, I saw them, not directly, not fully, but enough. The man standing near the doorway, his posture no longer relaxed, no longer casual, his shoulders slightly tense, his expression tighter than before, like something had shifted for him too, like he had realized he was not in control of this situation the way he thought he was. And across from him, Dominic stood with the same calm precision, hands loosely at his sides, no raised voice, no sudden movement, just presence, the kind that filled a space without effort. I could not hear every word, but I caught pieces, fragments that slipped through the silence. "You should not come here again," Dominic said, his tone even, almost conversational, but there was no mistaking the meaning underneath it, and the man let out a short breath, something between a laugh and a protest. "She did not say that," he replied, glancing briefly in my direction before looking back, and I felt that glance like a pull, like a reminder of everything I had tried to keep contained. Dominic's gaze followed that movement for a fraction of a second, and when it returned, it was sharper, more focused, like the pieces had aligned in a way that left no room for misunderstanding. "She does not need to," he said quietly, and the words settled into the Space with a finality that made my chest tighten, because it was not about permission anymore. It was about decision, and that decision had already been made. The man shifted his weight, his confidence thinning just enough to be noticeable, and for the first time since he arrived, he seemed uncertain, like he was recalculating, like he was trying to understand a set of rules he had not been given. "I am not here to cause problems," he said, his voice lower now, more measured, and Dominic nodded. Once, acknowledging the statement without agreeing to it. "Then do not," he replied. Simple, direct, and for a second, neither of them spoke, the silence stretching again, heavier this time, until finally, the man exhaled, running a hand through his hair in a gesture that felt more human than anything else he had done since stepping into this house. "I will go," he said, not defeated, but not challenging either, just accepting something he could not change, and I felt something in my chest loosen and tighten at the same time. Relief tangled with something more complicated, something I did not want to name. He turned then, his eyes finding mine one last time, searching, questioning, like he was waiting for something from me, a signal, a choice, but I gave him nothing. I could not here, not now, and after a second, he nodded slightly and walked out, the sound of the door closing echoing softly through the hallway, leaving behind a silence that felt completely different, not tense, not uncertain, but settled, like something had been resolved whether I understood it or not. I stayed where I was, half hidden by the corner, not moving, not breathing too loudly, until I felt it again, that shift in the air, that quiet awareness, and when I looked up, Dominic was already watching me, not surprised, not questioning, just there, like he had known exactly where I was the entire time. "You should not eavesdrop," he said, his voice calm, almost neutral, and I stepped fully into the hallway, forcing myself to meet his gaze, because looking away felt like losing ground I had already given too much of. "I was making sure everything was handled," I replied, the words coming out steadier than I felt, and something in his expression shifted, just slightly, not amusement, not approval, but something closer to acknowledgement, like he recognized the attempt. Even if he did not believe it, "Everything is handled," he said, and there was something final in the way he said it, something that told me this was not just about tonight, not just about that man. It was about everything that came with it, everything I had been trying to keep separate, everything that was no longer separate anymore. He took a step closer, not invading, not threatening, just enough to close the distance between us, and for a second, the world narrowed to that space, to that moment, to the quiet certainty in his eyes. "This will not happen again," he added, not asking, not suggesting, just stating, and I realized then that he was not giving me a choice. He was giving me a boundary, one that had already been drawn, one I would either follow or face the consequences of. And for the first time since all of this started, I understood something clearly. This was not about control anymore, not his, not mine. It was about protection, and whether I wanted it or not, I was already inside it. The house went quiet after that, not the kind of quiet that meant rest, but the kind that meant something had been decided and everyone else was expected to adjust accordingly. And I moved through the rest of the evening like I always did, finishing tasks, checking rooms, keeping everything in place, but nothing felt the same, not after the way he had looked at me, not after the way he had said it. "This will not happen again." And the words followed me. Not loud, not demanding, just present. Like a boundary I could not step outside of anymore. I returned to my room just after 10, closing the door softly behind me, leaning against it for a second longer than necessary, my fingers resting on the handle like I needed to confirm it was real, that I was still in control of something. Anything. The room was small, simple, familiar, and for the first time since I had moved into this house, it felt different too. Not unsafe. Not exactly, but no longer separate, no longer untouched by everything happening outside of it. I crossed the space slowly, setting my phone down on the nightstand, removing the pins from my hair one by one, letting it fall loose over my shoulders, the small, quiet rituals that usually help me settle. But tonight they did not work, because my mind would not stop replaying everything. The way the man had looked at me, the way Dominic had stepped in without raising his voice, without asking permission, and the way I had not stopped him. Not really. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at my hands, at the faint marks that were still there beneath my sleeves, hidden but not gone, and I realized something that unsettled me more than anything else. For the first time, I had not been thinking about how to hide them. I had been thinking about how he had seen them, and what that meant. My phone buzzed suddenly, sharp in the quiet, and my body reacted instantly. A small flinch I could not control. I stared at the screen for a second before picking it up, expecting the same name, the same pattern, but it was not. The number was unfamiliar. No contact, no label, just a single message waiting. I hesitated, my thumb hovering. But curiosity pushed through the hesitation. I opened it, and the words were simple, almost too simple. You are safe here. I frowned slightly, my mind trying to place it, trying to understand, because no one had my number here. No one should have. And then it clicked, not fully, not with certainty, but enough to make my chest tighten in a different way. This was not random. Nothing in this house was random. I looked at the message again, reading it twice, 3 times, and there was something about it that felt deliberate, not comforting, not soft, just certain, like a statement that did not need reassurance. I set the phone down slowly, my thoughts shifting, connecting pieces I had not wanted to connect before. The security outside earlier, the way the staff had been watching, the way everything had subtly changed after that moment in the hallway. This was not just about that man being told to leave. This was about something bigger, something I had been pulled into without realizing it. I stood and moved toward the window, pulling the curtain aside just enough to see the grounds outside. The lights were dim, controlled, but I could see movement, faint, calculated, someone stationed near the entrance, another figure further down the path, not obvious, not intrusive, but there, present, intentional, and my breath caught slightly, not from fear, but from understanding. This was not a suggestion. This was not a temporary reaction. This was protection, structured, organized, undeniable. I let the curtain fall back into place, stepping away from the window, my mind racing through everything I thought I knew about my life, about the choices I had made, about the lines I had drawn to keep things separate, and how easily those lines had been erased, not by force, not by confrontation, but by a single decision made by someone who did not need my permission to make it. I sat back down on the bed, my hands resting in my lap, still, quiet, but my thoughts were anything but, because I could feel it now, clearly, undeniably. Something had shifted, something irreversible, and whether I understood it or not, whether I accepted it or not, I was no longer just working in this house. I was part of something it had decided to keep. Morning came too quickly, not because I had slept well, but because I had not slept at all. The hours slipping past in quiet fragments where my mind refused to settle, replaying everything, analyzing every word, every look, every shift in the air that I could not unfeel. And when the first light filtered through the curtains, I was already awake, already sitting at the edge of the bed with my hands resting in my lap, like I had been waiting for something I could not name. The message still echoed in my mind. You are safe here. Not a question, not a comfort, just a statement. And I could not decide if that made it easier or harder to accept. I dressed slowly, deliberately, pulling on my uniform with the same precision I always used, but my movements felt different now, more aware, like I understood that every detail mattered in ways it had not before. When I stepped into the hallway, the house felt the same on the surface, polished, quiet, controlled, but underneath that, there was something else, something I could not see but could feel, like the structure itself had shifted slightly to accommodate something new, something permanent. I moved toward the kitchen, expecting routine to anchor me, to pull me back into something familiar, but even that felt altered. Staff greeted me the same way, polite, neutral, but their eyes lingered just a fraction longer, their awareness sharper, like they knew I had crossed into a space I had not occupied before, and no one needed to say it out loud. Because in this house, nothing important was ever said directly. It was understood. I focused on my tasks, preparing breakfast, aligning plates, measuring coffee with steady hands. But my thoughts kept drifting, not to fear, not to panic, but to something quieter, something more unsettling. Acceptance, not of what had happened, but of what it meant, and that realization sat heavy in my chest. Because acceptance meant acknowledging that I was no longer on the outside of whatever this was. I was inside it, whether I wanted to be or not. Around 8:15, I felt it before I saw it. that subtle shift in the air, that quiet stillness that followed him, and I did not look up immediately. I did not want to, because looking meant acknowledging, and acknowledging meant stepping further into something I could not step back from. But avoidance had never worked, not really. So after a second, I lifted my gaze, and there he was, standing in the doorway of the kitchen, exactly where he always appeared, exactly when he chose to, like time itself adjusted to his schedule. Dominic did not speak right away. He simply watched, his eyes moving over the room, taking in everything, and then settling on me. Not abruptly, not sharply, just deliberately, like he had already decided that was where his attention belonged. "Good morning," he said, his voice low, even, as if nothing had changed, as if everything was exactly as it had been before, and I nodded once, keeping my posture straight, my expression neutral. "Good morning, sir." The words felt the same, but they carried something different now, something I could not quite define. He stepped further into the room, his presence filling the space without effort, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence, stretching between us, not uncomfortable, not tense, just aware, like both of us understood that something had shifted and there was no need to explain it. "You slept here," he said after a moment. Not a question, just an observation, and I nodded again. Yes, simple, factual, safe. But his gaze held mine a fraction longer, like he was confirming something, like he was checking that what he had put in place had worked exactly the way he intended it to. And that realization settled deep in my chest, steady and undeniable. He moved past me then, reaching for a cup, pouring coffee with the same controlled precision he applied to everything. And for a second, the normalcy of the action almost made me forget everything else. Almost. "You will remain on the property," he said, not looking at me, his focus on the cup in his hand. But the words were clear, deliberate, final, and I felt them land. Not like a command, not like a restriction, but like a boundary that had already been established, one that did not require my agreement to exist. I swallowed, my fingers tightening slightly around the edge of the counter, but I did not argue. I did not question, because I understood something now that I had not understood before. This was not about control, not in the way I had feared. This was about something else. Something quieter, something more absolute. Protection that did not ask permission, protection that did not leave room for negotiation. And when I finally looked at him again, really looked, I saw it clearly for the first time. Not just the power, not just the control, but the decision behind it. The choice he had made the moment he saw what I had been trying to hide. And the way that choice had already begun to reshape everything around me, including me. "Understood," I said softly, and the word felt heavier than it should have, like it carried more than just agreement, like it marked a point I could not return from. And for a brief second, his gaze flickered back to mine, not approving, not questioning, just acknowledging, like he had expected nothing less. And that was the moment I realized something that settled deep in my chest, steady and unshakable. I was not being asked to stay. I had already been chosen to. The rest of the day unfolded with a kind of quiet inevitability, like everything had already been decided, and I was simply catching up to it. Step by step, breath by breath, I moved through my tasks with the same precision, the same discipline, but something inside me had shifted in a way I could not undo. Not after the way he had looked at me, not after the way he had said it. "You will remain on the property," not as a question, not as a request, but as something already in effect, already real. And I realized as the hours passed that nothing about my routine had actually changed. I was still working, still cleaning, still moving through the same spaces, but the meaning behind it had altered, like the same actions now existed under a different set of rules, a different understanding, and that understanding followed me into every room, every quiet moment, every breath I took inside these walls. By late afternoon, the house settled into its usual rhythm. Meetings behind closed doors, footsteps measured and controlled, voices low and intentional. And I found myself in the hallway outside the study, polishing the frame of a painting that did not need polishing, just to have something to do, just to keep my hands occupied, because stillness made it harder to ignore the thoughts that had begun to surface, not fear, not exactly, but questions I had been avoiding, questions about what this meant, about what I had agreed to without saying the words, about what it meant to be protected by someone who did not ask if you wanted it. The study door opened without warning, and I straightened instinctively, stepping back just enough to create space. Dominic stepped out, his presence as steady as ever, his gaze already fixed on me as if he had known exactly where I would be, and for a second neither of us spoke, the silence settling between us in that familiar, controlled way. "You are adapting," he said finally, his voice calm, observant, like he was stating a fact rather than offering an opinion, and I felt something tighten in my chest, not discomfort, not resistance, but recognition, because he was right. I was adapting, not because I had chosen to, but because there was no alternative that made sense anymore. "I am doing my job," I replied, keeping my tone even, grounded, but his gaze held mine a moment longer, like he was measuring the difference between what I said and what I meant. "That is not what I meant," he said quietly, and there was something in his voice now, something softer, not in tone, but in intent, like he was acknowledging something without needing to explain it. I swallowed, my fingers tightening slightly around the cloth in my hand, because this was the part one did not know how to navigate, not the work, not the routine, but this space where things were understood without being spoken. "I do not know what you expect from me," I admitted, the words leaving my mouth before I could stop them, and for a second, the vulnerability in them surprised even me, because I was not someone who asked questions, not here, not like this, but his expression did not change, not in the way I expected. There was no irritation, no dismissal, just that same steady focus, like he had been waiting for that exact moment. "I expect you to remain safe," he said, and the simplicity of the statement caught me off guard, because it should have felt restrictive, it should have felt like control, but it did not. It felt like something else entirely, something heavier, something that carried weight beyond the words themselves. I looked at him then, really looked, trying to understand, trying to find the edges of what he was offering, what he had already put in place without asking me. "And if I do not want that?" I asked quietly, not challenging, not defiant, just honest, because the question mattered. It had to matter. His gaze did not waver, not even slightly, and when he answered, his voice was as calm as ever, but there was something unmovable in it, something absolute. "That does not change what I will do," he said, and the words settled into me, steady and final, not harsh, not forceful, just true. And in that moment, I understood something I had been resisting since the beginning. This was not a negotiation. It was not something I could step in and out of. It was a decision that had already been made, one that included me whether I was ready for it or not. I let out a slow breath, my shoulders relaxing just slightly, not in surrender, but in acceptance of something I could no longer deny. "Then I suppose I do not have a choice," I said softly, and for the first time, something in his expression shifted, not dramatically, not obviously, but enough to make me realize that I had misunderstood something important. "You always have a choice," he said, his voice quieter now, almost reflective. "You simply chose to stay." And the words lingered, echoing in a way that made my chest tighten for a completely different reason, because he was right. I had stayed. I had not left, not when I could have, not when it would have been easier, and that realization settled deep inside me, steady and undeniable. I was not here because I had to be, not anymore. I was here because somewhere along the way, I had stopped running, and when I finally looked at him again, there was something new in my expression, something I had not allowed myself to feel before, not fear, not uncertainty, but something quieter, something stronger, understanding, and maybe, just maybe, that was the most dangerous thing of all.